Before we get started in 1 Kings chapter 16, we want to go through the outline of the book as we do each week. And we've outlined the book of Kings, 1st and 2nd Kings together. And we've said that 1 through 11 was the reign of Solomon. That's the end of the United Kingdom, as the kingdom is going to divide in chapter 12. And so 1 through 11 of 1 Kings is the reign of Solomon. Then the divided kingdom begins in chapter 12. Again, that's where the kingdom divides under Rehoboam. And that lasts through chapter 17 of 2 Kings. That's because 18 through 25 is where we have recorded for us the fall of Israel first in 18, and then the fall of Judah at the end of the book. And so those are those last days of Judah after the fall of Israel. We're also going through 2 Chronicles, and we've outlined that book into two major sections. 1 to 9 was the reign of Solomon, and it was in chapter 10 that the kingdom divided. And then the divided kingdom goes, it's the kings of Judah during the divided kingdom in 10 through 36. Because Chronicles is focusing, as we said each week, on the kings of Judah and not the kings of Israel. It mentions kings of Israel, but as they come in contact with the kings of Judah, this is the Chronicles of the kings of Judah, and so we're following the line of David. Let's get into 1 Kings chapter 16. We're in 1 Kings 16 through 19, and then 2 Chronicles 16 and 17 this week. In chapter 16, it begins with a prophecy against Baasha in verse 1, where it says, "Now the word of the Lord came to Jehu the son of Hanani against Baasha, saying, Inasmuch as I exalted you from the dust and made you leader over my people Israel, and you have walked in the way of Jeroboam, and have made my people Israel sin, provoking me to anger with their sins. Behold, I will consume Baasha and his house, and I will make your house like the house of Jeroboam the son of Nebat. Anyone of Baasha who dies in the city, the dogs will eat, and anyone of his who dies in the field, the birds of the heavens will eat. Now the rest of the acts of Baasha and what he did in his might, are they not written in the books of the Chronicles of the kings of Israel?" So here Baasha's risen to power, and if we remember right, Jeroboam, the kingdom's been taken away from the family of Jeroboam for what reason? It's been taken away from Jeroboam because of his sins. And it's told here in verse 2 that what has Baasha done? Same thing. He walked in the way of Jeroboam and made the people of Israel to sin. And so he was going to suffer, him and his household were going to suffer the same punishment as the household of Jeroboam. Anyone that died in the city, the dogs would eat. Anyone who died in the field, the birds would eat. So the kingdom's going to be taken away from Baasha. Remember this is one of the hard parts about the kings. If you try and remember your kings of Israel and Judah, in Judah, you follow the line of David. That's where it is in Judah. Most of the time you have a father and then a son succeed him. Occasionally you'll have, Athaliah that rules. But other than that, for the most part, you have a father and a son that rules. And occasionally you have a brother of one of them that rules if they didn't have a son. But it's easy to follow. We're still all following the line of David. What makes it difficult in Israel is we're constantly changing the family that is in power. Not just the person in power, but this family's in power. They do wicked. They're taken out. This other family takes over. They do evil. Their family's taken away from the throne. This other family steps in, and it just continues on because there was no good king in all of Israel. And so we're constantly having kings change over and our families change over and over as we move through. And so just as the house of Baasha was going to be punished, just as the house of Jeroboam was, because of the acts that Baasha did here in 1 to 5, and that's told to him by Jehu the son of Hanani. Now beginning at verse 6 and going through verse 28, we just have sort of a quick recording of some of the history of Israel. Something to remember about the divided kingdom, particularly in Israel, is this. Not only are we changing families, but because there is no established family line, we have times where a man wants to seize the throne, he's going to kill the king and take the throne for himself. And that's one reason you constantly are changing. You might have somebody rule for a few days, somebody might rule for many years. It just sort of depends on how things are going at that time. So beginning at verse 6, it said that Baasha slept with his fathers and was buried in Tirzah. And Elah his son became king in his place. Moreover, the word of the Lord brought the prophet Jehu the son of Hanani also came against Baasha and his household, both because of all the evil which he did in the sight of the Lord, provoking him to anger with the work of his hands, and being like the house of Jeroboam, and because he struck it. In the 26th year of Asa, king of Judah, remember Asa was ruling last week when we finished off. We'll pick up with him when we get to 2 Chronicles here later on. But it's still in the time that Asa is ruling. In his 26th year, that Elah the son of Baasha became king over Tirzah and reigned 2 years. His servant Zimri, commander of half his chariots, conspired against him. Now he was at Tirzah drinking himself drunk in the house of Arza, who was over the household of Tirzah. Then Zimri went in and struck him and put him to death in the 27th year of Asa, king of Judah, and became king in his place. Again, that's one of those we have here. Zimri comes in, and he kills the king, and he seizes the throne for himself. And it came about when he became king, as soon as he sat on the throne, that he killed all the household of Baasha. He did not leave a single male, neither of his relatives nor of his friends. Again, the family of Baasha was going to suffer destruction. They were going to be destroyed just like the house of Jeroboam because of the wicked they had done. That's what's taking place here. Thus Zimri destroyed all the household of Baasha according to the word of the Lord, which he spoke against Baasha through Jehu the prophet. For all the sins of Baasha and the sins of Elah his son, which they sinned and which they made Israel sin, provoking the Lord God of Israel to anger with their idols. Now the rest of the acts of Elah, and all that he did, are they not written in the books of the Chronicles of the kings of Israel? Now, in the 27th year of Asa, king of Judah, Zimri reigned how long? 7 days. At Tirzah, and that's when the people were camped at Gibbethon, which belonged to the Philistines. Remember what we said, sometimes people reign for short periods of time in Israel, some reign for long periods of time. For the most part in Judah, you have some lengthier reigns. Here's something for you. Judah lasts a lot longer than Israel does. If you look at the years, it lasts for over 100 years more. I think it's like 120 years longer that Judah lasts than Israel. But they only had 1 or 2 more kings, I think it was, to sit on the throne than all of Israel. The difference was Israel, with that constant friction between them, was killing each other off, and there was constant change. Versus in Judah, there were some lengthier reigns that were taking place. People like Manasseh that reigned for, I think it was like 55 years. And so you have some lengthier reigns that are taking place in those days. Even Asa here is already in his 27th year at the time that Zimri takes the throne. But Zimri has been reigning for 7 days, and the people that were camped in verse 16 heard it and said, Zimri has conspired and has struck down the king. Therefore all Israel made Omri, the commander of the army, king over Israel that day in the camp. You see, if you can imagine being one of the soldiers for a second, you're out in the field and you're at wartime, and you find out, and it's been about that, the king was killed by Zimri, one of the commanders in his army. But the people don't want Zimri to be the ruler. Who do they want? Omri to be the ruler. So they anoint him as ruler. And then Omri and all Israel, in verse 17, went up from Gibbethon and besieged Tirzah. That's where Zimri is. When Zimri saw the city was taken, he went into the citadel of the king's house and burned the king's house over him with fire and died. Because of his sins which he sinned, doing evil in the sight of the Lord, walking in the way of Jeroboam, and in his sin which he did, making Israel sin. Now the rest of the acts of Zimri and his conspiracy which he carried out, are they not written in the books of the Chronicles of the kings of Israel? He comes to the throne, he's there 7 days. He carried out what the Lord said about the house of Baasha being destroyed, but Zimri does evil. Omri comes and seizes the throne, and Zimri sees that he's defeated, and he burns the palace down around himself. So then in verse 21, the people were divided into 2 parties. Half of the people followed Tibnah, the son of Ginath, to make him king, and the other half followed Omri. But the people who followed Omri prevailed over the people who followed Tibnah, the son of Ginath, and Tibnah died, and Omri became king. In the 31st year of Asa, king of Judah, Omri became king over Israel and reigned 12 years. He reigned 6 years at Tirzah. He brought the hill Samaria from Shemir and for 2 talents of silver, and he built on the hill and named the city which he built Samaria after the name of Shemir, the owner of the hill. And Omri did evil in the sight of the Lord and acted more wickedly than all who were before him. For he walked in all the way of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, and in his sins which he made Israel sin, provoking the Lord God of Israel with their idols. Now the rest of the acts of Omri which he did, and his might which he showed, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Israel? So Omri slept with his fathers, and was buried at Samaria, and Ahab his son became king in his place. So now Omri's king, and there's still friction here between Omri, as we've seen, and Tibnah, the son of Ginath, that the other half are trying to follow. And so as they're trying to follow them, there's this friction between them. By the way, look back in verse 15. What year of Asa is it that Zimri takes the throne? 27th year. Now, when you come on down, the people had been divided, and it said in verse 23 that in the 31st year of Asa, king of Judah, Omri became king over Israel and reigned 12 years. He reigned 6 years in Tirzah. So there's about 4 years. There's 4 years there in which you have this friction between the people following Omri and the people following Tibnah taking place from the 27th year of Asa to the 31st year of Asa. There's this strife continuing on. But as time goes on, Omri, it says in verse 25, did more evil and more wickedly than all who were before him. And you think about that for just a second. That when you come to Omri here in verse 25, and it says he did more evil, and you think about the men that were before him. You think about Jeroboam, and you think about Baasha and how bad they were, and the houses were destroyed. But here's Omri. Omri did more wicked than them. Now, that's only going to be said one more time, that they did more wicked than all that were before them. That will be the next king that we're picking up with here in verse 29, and this is going to be the reign of Ahab. Where it said that Ahab, son of Omri, became king over Israel in the 38th year of Asa, king of Judah, and Ahab, the son of Omri, reigned over Israel and Samaria 22 years. Ahab, the son of Omri, did evil in the sight of the Lord more than all who were before him. That's not said again, by the way. From here on out, it'll be said they walked in the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat. But what makes Ahab such a terrible ruler? Why is it that they did more wicked than all those that were before him? A couple of things. His wife. And then we'll see that here in just a second as we look in verse 31. But what else is it? The Asherah and the Baal and bringing all that in. That eventually is taken out. But what remains is the idols that Jeroboam set up that are still being worshipped. And so others were following in the sins of Jeroboam, but not in the sins of Ahab. And so it's after Ahab that he did more wicked than all that were before him. But there was no more wicked king in all Israel than Ahab. But I think verse 31 is an interesting statement. That it came about as though it had been a trivial thing for him to walk in the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat. That he married Jezebel, the daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians, and went to serve Baal and worshipped him. You know, it points out in verse 31, I think it's an interesting phrase there, as if it had been a trivial thing. As if it was almost nothing to have continued in the sins of Jeroboam. As if it was a very small or nothing at all. He then introduces Baal worship after he married Jezebel. By the way, I think there's something important we note in verse 31, and that's the power of influence. Because it points out, before it mentions the introduction of Baal worship, who he married. That he married Jezebel and went to serve Baal and worshipped him. But it's after that. By the way, it's not necessarily spelled the same way, but you can notice in the names of the Sidonians oftentimes the name Baal. Jezebel. Her father was Ethbaal. Even though it may not be spelled exactly the same at the end of Jezebel, you can you hear that pronounced in there. It was oftentimes done as they were worshiping Baal. Those are put in there sort of supposed to be as a sign of respect. And you can see their worship there. And these are people that are devoted to the service of Baal and worshiping him. And he marries Jezebel, and this is what it leads to him doing. He'd already been walking before he married her in the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat. But then he married her and he introduced Baal worship. So he erected, in verse 32, an altar for Baal in the house of Baal, which he built in Samaria. Ahab also made the Asherah. Thus Ahab did more to provoke the Lord, the God of Israel, than all the kings who were before him. And in the days Heel the Bethlehemite built Jericho, he laid its foundations with the loss of Abram his firstborn, and set up its gates with the loss of his youngest son Segub, according to the word of the Lord which he spoke by Joshua the son of Nun. I want you to notice something there in verse 34. Joshua 6:26 says that cursed before the Lord is the man who rises up and builds the city of Jericho. With the loss of his firstborn he shall lay its foundation, and with the loss of his youngest son he shall set up its gates. So all the way back in the book of Joshua, the Lord said that when somebody sets this up, when somebody tries to rebuild this, that it's going to be with the loss of his firstborn that he lays the foundation, with the loss of his youngest he sets up the gates. Here's something important to note. A lot of time has passed when we come to this passage right here. By the time we come to the days of Ahab and this is done, a lot of time has passed since that was promised, but the Lord kept His promise. He kept His promise that He made, and it was exactly as He said it would be back in the book of Joshua. By the way, why do you think it is in verse 34? It seems sort of all of a sudden like it's Ahab, how bad Ahab is, how bad Ahab is. Then all of a sudden there's this statement about this man that tried to rebuild Jericho, and you come into chapter 18, and we pick up with Elijah talking to Ahab. Why is it that story is mentioned here at the end of chapter 16? It's a good point. It's a reminder that God punishes those who do not obey Him. I think another reason it could also be recorded here is it shows us just how bad things have gotten. Things have already gotten pretty bad under Jeroboam and all these others. By the days of Ahab, it's just complete and total disrespect and disregard for what God said. And here's this man that all of a sudden he goes back and builds the city tries to build the city of Jericho. Very thing God said don't do. Kind of reminds me of when we get to the end of the book of Judges, how you go through the book of Judges and you hear about this deliverance, but there's those stories at the end that serve as a reminder that are not in chronological order. Some of those stories took place very early on, but they're there to sort of remind us, here's how bad things got in the days of the Judges. I think that's what this story here, 34, also does for us, is it can remind us here, here's how bad things got. And God still punished them for what they did. But it got so bad that there was disrespect and disregard for all of God's word. We come into chapter 17 now, and this is where Elijah prays and predicts the drought. And I say prays and predicts, it just says here that Elijah the Tishbite, who was one of the settlers of Gilead, said to Ahab, as the Lord the God of Israel lives, before whom I stand, surely there shall be neither dew nor rain these years, except by my word. Remember this, James 5 and in verse 16 and 17 points this out. The effective fervent prayer of a righteous man can accomplish much. And it says in verse 17, Elijah was a man with a nature like ours who prayed that it would not rain, and it did not rain. So Elijah prays for this punishment upon Israel to remind them and to sort of sit there and then to take a look back, to evaluate themselves and realize we need to make a change. God is punishing us for the way that we're living. In fact, eventually, he does pray, as it points out in that passage, and we'll see this later on, and it does rain again. And that's recorded for us in James chapter 5. He prays, but he also tells Ahab this is going to happen. The Lord is not going to send rain. There'll be neither dew nor rain. By the way, how long does this last? 3 years and 6 months, according to James. It's also recorded in James 5:17. He prayed that it would not rain, and it did not rain for 3 years and 6 months. And then that's when he prayed that it would rain, which we'll get to in chapter 18. The Lord tells Elijah then in verse 2 to go away from here and turn eastward and hide yourself by the brook Cherith, which is east of the Jordan. And then he said, it shall be that you will drink of the brook, and I have commanded the ravens to provide for you there. And it shall be, so he went and did according to the word of the Lord, for he went and lived by the Cherith, which is east of the Jordan. The ravens brought him bread and meat in the morning, and bread and meat in the evening, and he would drink from the brook. It happened after a while the brook dried up because there was no rain in the land. So he's gone and he's been at the brook after he's told Ahab this drought's going to happen. He's been at the brook and he's been fed by the ravens and he drinks at the brook, but the brook's dried up. So, beginning at verse 8 and going through verse 24, that the word of the Lord came to him saying, "Arise and go to Zarephath, which belongs to" where? Sidon. "And stay there. Behold, I have commanded a widow there to provide for you." So he's told to go where again? Sidon. Here's something interesting. Go back just one chapter earlier. It came about in verse 31, as though it had been a trivial thing for him to walk in the sins of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, he married Jezebel, the daughter of Ethbaal, king of who? Sidonians. That's the very land in which he actually goes, is the land from which Jezebel is from. He's not in Israel. He goes to the land of the Sidonians. This is important as we go through the story to understand something about this. He comes to this widow. He arises and goes to Zarephath, and when he came to the gates of the city, behold, a widow was there gathering sticks. And he called to her and said, "Please give me a little jar of water that I may drink." And she was going to get it. He called to her and said, "Please bring me a piece of bread in your hand." In verse 12 it says, "But she said, As the Lord your God lives, I have no bread, only a handful of flour in the bowl and a little oil in the jar. And behold, I'm gathering a few sticks that I may go in and prepare for me and my son, that he may eat it and die. We may eat it and die." Then Elijah said to her, "Do not fear, go do as you have said, but make me a little bread cake from it first and bring it out to me. And afterward you may make one for yourself and for your son. For thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, the bowl of flour shall not be exhausted, nor shall the jar of oil be empty, until the day that the Lord sends rain on the face of the earth." So she went and did, verse 15, according to the word of Elijah, and she and he and her household ate for many days. And the bowl of flour was not exhausted, nor did the jar of oil become empty, according to the word of the Lord which he spoke through Elijah. I want you to think about this for just a second. As he comes to this widow here at Zarephath, and he asks her for water and for bread, and she says that she doesn't have bread, and she goes to make this, she says she was gathering up, had just some flour and oil, and was going to make for her and her son to eat and then die. I mean, remember, as there's this drought, there's nothing growing and all this going on, and so she's expecting with this famine going on, they're just going to eat and die. But Elijah tells her, "If you make some for me first, the Lord has said that as long as this lasts, what's going to happen? Flour won't run out, and the oil won't be empty." Now I want you to think about this for just a second. This is not a woman among the Israelites. This is not somebody who would have been sitting there and heard their fathers and so on, and grandfather and so on and so forth tell the stories and the histories of Israel. But somehow she knew and trusted. She acknowledged, by the way, when he first appeared to her and came to him in verse 12, that she said, "As the Lord your God lives, I have no bread, only a handful of flour in the bowl and a little oil in the jar." She acknowledges the Lord your God lives. And he says, "Well, the Lord my God has said what? It's not going to run out." And I want you to think and just appreciate for a second the faith of this woman, that she took Elijah's word when he says that the Lord has said, and goes and does as Elijah said, and the flour didn't run out, and the oil didn't run out. And just think about that for just a second. Again, this is not a woman among the Israelites. This is one among the Sidonians. And she must have somewhere heard the stories about the Lord and what he did for Israel. I know that for one because in verse 12, she actually addresses the Lord by the term Yahweh. In verse 12, you'll notice it is in all caps. She addresses him by the name that the Hebrews referred to him as. And said that she had no bread. And he tells him that Yahweh would provide. He uses the term that the Hebrews use for God and tells her that the Lord has said he will provide for you if you provide first for me. So she must have known something about the stories of Israel. She must have known something to have referred to the Lord by His name and to have had that faith when Elijah said that God would provide. And so she does exactly as it was said, and it happened that they didn't run out of food. But in verse 17, that it came about after these things that the son of the woman, the mistress of the house, became sick. And his sickness was so severe there was no breath left in him. And she said to Elijah, "What do I have to do with you, O man of God? You have come to me to bring my iniquity to remembrance and to put my son to death." He said to her, "Give me your son." And he took him from her bosom and carried him to the upper room where he was living and laid him on the bed. And he called out to the Lord and said, "O Lord my God, have you also brought calamity to the widow with whom I am staying by causing her son to die?" Then he stretched himself upon the child 3 times and called to the Lord, saying, "O Lord my God, I pray you, let this child's life return to him." And the Lord heard the voice of Elijah, and the life of the child returned to him, and he revived. Elijah took the child and brought him down from the upper room into the house and gave him to his mother. And Elijah said, "See, your son is alive." The woman said to Elijah, "Now I know that you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord is in your mouth is true." Seems there must have been some doubting still on her part, but she comes to him first, and she says, "You've come to me to bring my iniquity to remembrance." So there was something that she must have felt somewhat guilty about that's been brought to remembrance. Here's this man that says he's a prophet of God, and now her son's put to death, that her iniquity is being brought to remembrance. But he takes the child into the room that he was staying, stretched himself out on him 3 times, and prayed to God. Again, I want you to think about this. The specific example mentioned in James 5 is the prayer for there not to be rain and then for there to be rain. But James 5:16, the effective fervent prayer of a righteous man can avail much. Elijah is a man with a nature like ours. Not just in the prayer that's mentioned specifically there, but there are other occasions, such as this, where he prays to God. He prayed to God to let the life return to the child, and it did. And then the woman truly believed in verse 24, as she says, "Now I know you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord in your mouth is true." And so here he raises this widow's son after spending some time with her, and she believes now that what he is saying is true, that he is a prophet from God. Chapter 18, we have Obadiah, Ahab, and Elijah. Obadiah had taken and had done what with some of the prophets here in chapter 18? Taken, and he has hidden some of them away. But the Lord had told first, let's back up to verse 1 first, where the Lord told Elijah to go show himself to Ahab. So he went to show himself, and the famine had been severe in Samaria. And Ahab called Obadiah, who was over his household. And Obadiah feared the Lord greatly. And so when Jezebel had destroyed the prophets, he took 100 prophets and hid them by 50s in a cave and provided for them bread and water. So he's taken and he's hidden them away. But he's somebody here that, as he fears the Lord, he's still there with Ahab. And Ahab says to him to go throughout all the land to the springs of water in the valleys, that perhaps they will find grass and keep the horses and mules alive and not have to kill some of the cattle. So Obadiah goes one way, Ahab goes another way. Well, Elijah runs into Obadiah and tells him to go back to Ahab and to tell him that he's seen Elijah. And Obadiah is afraid because, as he points out, Ahab has been searching for Elijah all this time that Elijah's been gone, and going to cities and asking if he's there and making them swear that they did not have Elijah there. Elijah tells him, "Go on back and tell Ahab." So he goes and he tells Ahab that he's there. He tells him in verse 15 that as the Lord of hosts lives before whom I stand, I will surely show myself to him today. So Obadiah went and told Ahab, and Ahab went to meet Elijah. But I want you to notice something in verse 17 real quick. How does Ahab refer to Elijah? The troubler of Israel. Is it you, you troubler of Israel? Ahab seems to think, after Elijah has made this prophecy to him, would seem to be the indication that Elijah is the cause of the problem. Well, Elijah did pray to God that it would not rain, but Elijah prayed to the Lord that it would not rain to punish Israel because of what? Because of their sins and because of the direction Ahab has been leading them. Here's something I learned in this here. Sometimes people that think somebody else is the problem can be the problem themselves. And what I mean by that is Ahab thought Elijah was the one sort of stirring up the trouble. But it was Ahab that was the cause of the trouble. It was Elijah who was doing what was right. In fact, he points out in verse 18 that I have not troubled Israel, but you and your father's house have, because you have forsaken the commandments of the Lord and you have followed the Baals. And so Ahab thought Elijah was the trouble, but Elijah points out, no, it's you, because you have not followed the Lord's commandments and you have served the Baals. But he tells him in verse 17 to gather together the prophets of Baal and of the Asherah. And they came together, or they come and meet him at Mount Carmel. In verse 21, here we have recorded for us Elijah and the prophets of Baal, what happens at Mount Carmel in 20 through 40. In verse 21, Elijah said, how long will you hesitate between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him, but if Baal, follow him. But the people did not answer him a word. You can imagine the way the people are is it's not like Israel's over here and they're serving entirely Baal. They want to serve Baal, but then sometimes claim they're serving God. And they're not over here entirely serving God, but they may want to claim they're serving God and then turn over here and serve Baal. As he points out, they're hesitating between two opinions. And Elijah makes the point, listen, if the Lord is God, then serve him. And if it's Baal, serve him. But you can't teeter between the two. And we're going to serve Baal over here, and then we're going to come serve the Lord over here, and then we're going to come back and serve Baal over here and go between the two. I think of the passage in Matthew chapter 6 and in verse 24, that you cannot serve two masters. And so that's what Elijah's really telling them here. You can't continue to serve God and Baal. You've got to make up your mind one way or the other. And for time's sake, we won't read through all of this, but we know the story very well. Here they have the prophets of Baal, and the challenge is Elijah's on one side with an altar and a sacrifice, and the prophets of Baal are on the other side with an altar and a sacrifice. And they were going to call out to their God that he would send fire down to consume the sacrifice. They weren't to light it. And so the prophets of Baal are there, and they're crying out to Baal to light this sacrifice, and nothing happens. And Elijah sort of pokes fun at them. Call out with a louder voice. In verse 27, for he is a God. Either he's occupied or gone aside or is on a journey, or perhaps he is asleep and needs to be awakened. Verse 28, they cried out louder. They cut themselves according to their customs with swords and lances until the blood gushed out of them. And when midday was past, they raved until the time of the offering of the evening sacrifice. But there was no voice, and no one answered, and no one paid attention. So here they're trying to serve Baal, but nothing happens. He never sends anything. Now it's Elijah's turn. Elijah said all the people come near, and they came near to him in verse 30, and he repaired the altar of the Lord which had been torn down. And he took 12 stones according to the number of the tribes of the sons of Jacob, to whom the word of the Lord had come, saying, Israel shall be your name. And with the stones he built an altar in the name of the Lord, and he made a trench around the altar, large enough to hold 2 measures of seeds. And he arranged the wood and cut the ox in pieces and laid it on the wood. And he said, fill 4 pitchers with water and pour it on the burnt offering and on the wood. And he said, do it a second time. And they did it a second time. And he said, do it a third. And they did it a third. And the water flowed around the altars. That's also filled the trench with water. And think about this for just a second. Here the prophets of Baal have been crying out. They have the sacrifice ready to go. Everything's ready to go. They've been crying out all day long. They've cried well past midday into the time of the evening sacrifice, and nothing's happened. Now Elijah gets ready to offer the sacrifice, and he's repaired the altar, and he digs this trench, and he has them pour 4 pitchers of water on it 3 times. So 12 total pitchers of water are poured on it, so that the trench around the altar is filled. And at the time of the offering of the evening sacrifice, Elijah the prophet came near and said, O Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, today let it be known that you are God in Israel, and I am your servant, and I have done all these things at your word. Answer me, O Lord, answer me, that this people may know that you, O Lord, are God, and that you have turned their heart back again. Then the fire of the Lord fell and consumed the burnt offering, and the wood, and the stones, and the dust, and licked up the water that was in the trench. When all the people saw it, they fell on their faces and they said, "The Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God." So you think about it here as they've been crying, as Elijah told them, you hesitate between two opinions. If the Lord is God, serve Him. If Baal, serve him. But you've been torn and teetering between the two. And here are the prophets of Baal gold and nothing happens. Here Elijah goes and he cries out to God, and fire comes down and it consumes the sacrifice. It says it consumed the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, and the dust, and it licked up the water in the trench. Now Israel sees what has happened, and Israel believes, and they cry out, "The Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God." And so He tells them in verse 40 to seize the prophets of Baal and Asherah and to kill them. And they seized the prophets of Baal and didn't let them escape, and they killed them at the brook Kishon and slew them there. In verse 41 then, through the end of the chapter, the drought is going to end. Elijah told Ahab to go up and eat, and there was a sound of roar of heavy shower, and so he went up to eat and drink. Elijah went to the top of Mount Carmel and crouched there on the earth and put his face between his knees. He said to his servant, "Go up now, look toward the sea." So he went up and looked and said, "There is nothing." He said, "Go back 7 times. And it came about the 7th that he said, "Behold, a cloud as small as a man's hand is coming up from the sea." And he said, "Go up, say to Ahab, prepare your chariot and go down, so that heavy shower does not stop you." In a little while the sky grew black with clouds and wind, and there was a heavy shower, and Ahab rode and went to Jezreel. And the hand of the Lord was on Elijah, and he girded up his loins and outran Ahab to Jezreel. Now, the drought is ended here in 18. We come into 19, and Elijah is going to have to flee from Jezebel. Ahab comes to Jezebel and tells her all that Elijah had done in killing the prophets of Baal with the sword. And so she said, "So may God do to me, and even more, if I do not make your life as the life of one of them by tomorrow at this time." That's what she sent a message to Elijah saying. So Elijah gets up and he flees, and he comes to this juniper tree and he sits down. In verse 5, and an angel came touching him and said, "Arise and eat." And he ate, and the angel told him the same thing, and he arose and he ate. And he drank, and then he went on the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the mountain of God. Then we have recorded for us at 9 through 21 what happens at Mount Horeb. So here he is at Mount Horeb, and remember, this is where Elijah sort of sulks, says, I and I alone am left. You know, just go ahead and let me die. I'm all that's left. And this is when, you have the case here where he was told to go forth and stand on the mountain, and behold, the Lord was passing by. And so there was a strong wind rendering and breaking in pieces the rocks before the Lord, but the Lord wasn't in the wind. And after the wind was an earthquake, but he was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake was a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a sound of a gentle blowing. Elijah heard it, wrapped his face in his mantle, and went out and stood in the entrance of the cave. And behold, a voice came to him and said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And that's when he said he's been zealous for the Lord, and that he and he alone is left, and that they seek his life to take it away. And he's told to return to Damascus to anoint Hazael king over Aram, Jehu the son of Nimshi as the king over Israel, and Elisha the son of Shaphat of Abel Meholah to anoint as a prophet in the place of Elijah. And then he said, "Behold, it came to pass, whoever escaped Hazael, Jehu would kill, and whoever escaped Jehu, Elisha would put to death." But he's told in verse 18 that yet I will leave in Israel 7,000, all the knees that have not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him. Elijah looked at himself at that time and thought, I and I alone am left. But the Lord points out to him, there's still 7,000 that have not bowed their knee to Baal. And I think we need to remind ourselves sometimes that, figuratively speaking, there will always be the 7,000 that haven't bowed their knee to Baal. As we look around and think at times and we get distraught with all that's going on, there are others striving to do what is right and suffering at the same time. Now, let's turn over to 2 Chronicles 16 and 17. We'll run through these rather quickly. 2 Chronicles 16 divides itself into 3 sections. You have the war between Asa and Baasha, then Asa and what happens between Asa and the prophet of Hanai, and then we have the death of Asa. If you remember last week with Asa, what does he do that we learned about last week that was admirable? He did. The high places were the only thing he did leave. Remember, he's the one that removed his mother from being queen mother because of what she had done. I wish that's where the story ended with Asa, but unfortunately it doesn't. Because it said here in verses 2 and 3, he seeks the help of Ben-Hadad of Aram for help in his fight against Baasha instead of seeking help from the Lord. And so then that's when we come down to here in 7 through 10, and Asa and the prophet Hananiah, and Hananiah is telling him down there that because you've relied on the king of Aram and have not relied on the Lord, therefore the army of the king of Aram has escaped out of your hand. And so he talks about how he's going to be punished for that. And this did not set well with Asa. In fact, later on, it said in his 39th year of his reign, in verse 12, he became diseased in his feet. He doesn't seek the Lord there either, but instead he seeks the physicians. But he has the prophet locked into prison for what he says to him here in 7 through 10. And then again later on, he seeks the physicians instead of help from the Lord later on. Chapter 17, Jehoshaphat succeeds his father here in 1 and 2. And 3 through 19 talks about some of the reign of Jehoshaphat. I want to notice 3 through 6 rather quickly. The Lord was with Jehoshaphat because he followed the example of his father's David earlier and did not seek the Baals. He sought the Lord God of his father, followed his commandments, and did not act as Israel did. So the Lord established the kingdom in his control, and all Judah brought tribute to Jehoshaphat, and he had great riches and honor. He took great pride in the ways of the Lord, and again removed the high places in the Asherim from Judah. Jehoshaphat's reign is a lot like the early part of his father's reign, except Jehoshaphat does take down all of the high places. But Jehoshaphat is a good king, but he makes some mistakes. And we'll talk about Jehoshaphat, some of the mistakes Jehoshaphat makes next week when we get into chapters 18 through 20 and talk about the treaty he makes with Ahab and joining forces with Ahab several times in battle. But remember this, Jehoshaphat is a good king. He's a good king that made some mistakes, but Jehoshaphat was a good king. Now real quickly, let's talk about some of these practical lessons before we finish. This first one right here, this close isn't good enough. Asa did a lot of good things as king. There's no denying that Asa did a lot of good things in his early reign as king. But it came to a point in his life where Asa quit seeking the Lord, and he sought the help of men in battle, and he sought the help of the physicians when he became diseased in his feet. It didn't matter how long Asa had been serving God. What mattered was how he finished his race on this earth, and that is he finished by turning away from the Lord. We see the power of God, especially what takes place at Mount Carmel, as that fire comes down and consumes the sacrifices and the wood and dries up the trench. I think we didn't understand this right here. There's always going to be the 7,000. We've talked about this already. But we need to remind ourselves that no matter how dark things seem, no matter how bad it looks, there are still those who desire to serve God and to serve Him faithfully. I see something of the power of prayer in the prayers of Elijah. It's not recorded here about him praying for it to not rain. We see that in James chapter 5. But we do see him praying for the son of the widow of Zarephath to be raised, and the Lord raising the widow's son. And I see something about the power of influence with Jezebel's influence over Ahab. Ahab was a wicked king. Ahab would have been a wicked king without Jezebel. He walked in the steps of Jeroboam, but he then turns to serve the Baals, and as it points out, as if it had been a trivial thing. In spite of all that, the fact that he's already serving the idols that are set up by Jeroboam, he turns away, or he turns even farther to serve the Baals because of the influence of Jezebel. And I think we need to learn something about the power that others can have over us with their influence. Next week we'll be in 1 Kings chapter 20 through 22 and 2 Chronicles 18 through 20.